Very special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars for providing the vehicle in this review. As of course you'll know if you've watched my other reviews with them, they are based in Glastonbury in the southwest of England. And of course, if you want to check out all of their current stock, which changes pretty regularly, as you can tell from some of the cars that I've reviewed, then click the link to their website down in the video description, and you can see what they've currently got for sale. One of the fortunate things that actually happened when I reviewed this particular Jag XJ was that I drove this one back to back with its predecessor, and of course I reviewed that car a couple of days ago, the X350 generation. Now incidentally, I made a small correction in the pinned comment of that video because I named a particular version of that car wrongly. Of course the X350 had a facelift partway through, and I said it was called the X351 when it had that facelift. That was of course incorrect. It became the X358 because this car is the X351 generation. And even though the naming system doesn't make too much sense when it comes to those different models, you can easily tell them apart when it comes to looks. In fact, to the point of being controversial, because this is so different to all of the previous XJs, the previous cars to some degree, even up to and including the direct predecessor of this one, they still looked fairly conventional, and that's one of the things which is both a strong and perhaps for some people weaker point of the model. Younger people, generally speaking, probably wouldn't be as into it. Older gentlemen, traditional Jaguar buyers certainly would. That is a risky change to make because the XJ is a core part of what Jaguar is and where Jaguar sales come from. So this was a very bold move to move away from that. Now personally, I like the look of this generation. However, as I said in that previous review, which you can click at the top of the screen and see a review for, I actually prefer that older car, but the reasons why I say that actually don't have too much to do with the looks. See, I also prefer the Jag XK to the F-Type, and there are a number of similar reasons why. The newer car is great. In fact, it's great in a number of ways that the older car might not be, but it's not necessarily what I was looking for from a Jaguar. And we're going to get into that in this video. Because of course I'm not just going to talk negatives, there are plenty of positives that I have about this car, and in some ways it is superior to that previous vehicle. For one thing, let's talk about practicality. The XJ of course is predominantly a luxury car, with some performance in there as well on the XJR models, and this one definitely carries that over with that higher supercharged level model. This one that I drove though is the 3-litre Portfolio. Now that one comes in two different forms. The production run ran from 2010 to 2019, there was incidentally a minor facelift in 2014, some suspension changes, some rear entertainment changes, and some minor visual changes as well, but this particular one is the diesel Portfolio. Now they have both a 3-litre twin-turbo diesel V6 in this form, and there is also, for those who perhaps don't want a diesel engine in an XJ, a 3-litre supercharged petrol V6 as well, which incidentally is also designed to cater to the more practical, almost daily use kind of side, you know, a high-end executive sedan rather than a full-on luxury one for a VIP, for instance, and this car caters to that very well, especially, as with many of the cars that I've reviewed, and many of my favourite ones that I've reviewed, the used market. And that is the particular angle that we're talking about in this video, because we're not talking about buying a new one, not like you can anymore for this one anyway. This is a 2010 car, and you can pick one up used for about 10 grand, 12 grand, that kind of price range. Of course it depends on the spec and the mileage, but that for what was a 50, 60, 70 grand car is a pretty good placement. But to return to that practicality for just a second, one of the best things about this one is easily the fuel economy, and I referenced that in that previous review because the newer engine tech really does show on the latest vehicles out there compared to older ones. Even though they're only separated by sometimes a couple of years, the advances are very significant. This one for instance does 29 to the gallon in a city, which is a pretty good start for a luxury sedan. It can do 48 on the highway with a combined cycle of about 40 miles per gallon. That for a car of its size and spec is actually very good. Another reason why it's so good, despite being a massive car, and this really is a huge vehicle, it's even bigger than that previous car, which itself was bigger again from the 90s vehicle, is that it's not that heavy. Now this one does weigh more than that XJ which I reviewed before. That one was about 1600 kilos, just over. This one's about 1800, so it adds a couple of hundred kilos over the weight. But again, 1800 kilos is not bad at all for such a large car. This car actually reminded me in one specific way, and this will be an important thing for a potential buyer. It reminded me a lot of the Rolls-Royce that I reviewed. Now that was a 1990 Rolls-Royce, a classic in the truest sense, but the thing which I loved about that Rolls was the sheer presence that it had on the road. It wasn't the quickest thing around, it certainly didn't have the best handling by today's standards, but the sheer commanding presence that a Rolls-Royce, new or old, has on the road, well, it's hard to replicate that in another vehicle, and to me, in a modern sense, this reminded me a lot of that. It had that sheer vast size. It's almost like a land yacht of a car, and there is even a long wheelbase version which is another 5 inches longer and adds only 20 kilos to the weight, so that's not too much of a penalty to pay. Now, I already of course mentioned the fact that this particular one was the diesel engine. It's actually got a really good spec. That twin turbo gives it 271 horsepower and of course plenty of torque. And much like my older car, the Touareg V10, most of its performance comes from that torque. 443 pound-feet, which is more than enough to get the job done, and incidentally it allows the car to actually be pretty quick, given that it's not necessarily supposed to be a performance model. 0 to 60 in 6.4 seconds is not bad at all. Incidentally, it is speed limited to 155, to the surprise of precisely no one, so it does mean that you do have performance when you need it. Now we'll move to something which of course I always like to touch on because it's a hugely important thing for me about any car, and that is the interior. So what are my thoughts? The design, the kit, of course the space is always important to me for obvious reasons, the practicality in general. Does it manage to be both practical and good looking? Well, of course looks are always subjective. As far as I'm concerned, this is a stunning interior. I actually think that it's a fantastic looking interior on this particular XJ, and even though I prefer the, as I said, XK generation of GT over something like an F-Type, even as far as the interior goes, for this one, I think I do actually like this newer Jag-styled interior over that previous car. I love the previous one in its own way, but this looks so good from the inside, perhaps even better than it does from the outside. And to touch on that exterior design for just another second, the back end of this car always reminded me of a Maserati, which I quite like, actually. It was controversial, for sure, and some people might not want that from a Jag, but I think it's pretty cool. It has more flair. That actually ties into one of the biggest points that I want to make about this XJ, especially in comparison to its predecessor. Because you can easily pay these kind of prices for a lower mileage, higher spec previous generation. Something like an XJR, for example, if you want to go down the performance route. So there is some crossover there in terms of which one you might want to buy. The important thing is that these are appealing to simultaneously the same category of the market, but totally different kinds of buyer. And that's one of the things that I love about reviewing used cars. A used car not only makes the performance and the spec so much more affordable than it was when it was new, giving you these amazing bargains sometimes, but it actually makes a car's profile of what makes it good completely change. If you compare something like a brand new Aston Martin to a used one, that difference in price and the difference in rivals that it now has totally changes the parameters of what makes it good or not good. And an Aston is just an example. You can apply it to any car, new versus used. To me, this totally changes the parameters of what could make this a great or perhaps not so great car. So in line with that sentiment, the single thing which I believe is the most important question or assessment that you need to make in terms of whether you should get one of these XJs or maybe look at an older one, or even a classic, you could say, is it really depends on what you want from the car. And a lot of this you'll be able to tell just by looking at it from the interior, the exterior, if you like it or not, and then of course test driving a couple of them will really round out your dislikes and likes about the different ones and finalize which one you should go for. But to me, the older XJ is the pinnacle of taking old money looks and new money tech and putting them together. It was kind of the last time that Jaguar fully did that. This represents new money looks with old money values. It's almost a complete 180, because from the outside it's far more overtly stylish rather than, in my opinion at least, classy. I would call the older XJs classier than this car. They look more stately and more elegant. To me, this is a more stylish car. It's more funky, it's more modern, it's more sporty, you could say. It has more curves. But on the inside, it's actually more practical, more sensible, and more forward-thinking than many of those older cars are. So as I said, it's kind of a role reversal between the two. So that, to me, defines what kind of person should or shouldn't buy a newer or older XJ. If you want the traditional looks but with modern tech underneath, then maybe go for the older one. If you want something that looks every bit as new as it is, but also has old school values, good economy, reasonable tax, £265 a year, and more daily driver kind of executive tendencies, well then the newer car might be for you. In terms of how the two cars compare for stuff like handling and road feel, I don't feel like it's an entirely fair comparison to make, and that's one of the reasons why I left it until now in the video. But to me, the difference between the diesel portfolio in this case and of course the XJ8 with the 3.5 litre V8 in that older model, it doesn't line up that well. That one is a little bit more focused on performance than this car is, whereas this is almost completely focused on the economy and practicality side. So of course it's not going to feel necessarily the same. The brakes aren't necessarily as sharp and as responsive. The suspension certainly is worlds apart, and as I mentioned in that older review, I vastly prefer the handling on that car. I will say though that in this car there are a number of notable advantages. For instance, soundproofing, the overall style of the interior in terms of having a more modern touchscreen display. In fact, the entire heads-up display is all LCD, and you can actually customize what you can see in front of you. All these kind of smaller things that can make a pretty nice difference on a daily basis that the older car doesn't have. They're all considerations that you need to make. And touching on performance just one last time, it's kind of ironic as well that even though I mentioned the older one being more performance oriented, at least in its feel compared to this one's actually still quicker. The 0 to 60 on this car is about a second quicker than that older XJ, which again just highlights my point about newer engine technology. This one's designed to be practical and it still ended up a little bit quicker anyway. That's pretty cool. Although that does need to be tempered by the fact that it doesn't feel as quick as the older car. The sound isn't quite as visceral, the fun factor isn't quite there, because again, it's not really trying to aim for that. Now lastly, let's touch on things which maybe I didn't like in the case of this car, because there were a couple of potential drawbacks of the previous generation. So what are the drawbacks of this one? Well, in terms of its age, that's not going to be as much of a drawback because it is newer, the technology is newer, anything can break of course, but you do have those advances. Things which I didn't like tended to fall more on the ergonomic side. In particular, the space, and that was ironic to me. And it's one of the reasons why I was really impressed after driving this one when I went to that older XJ and drove that. Because if you watch that video, you'll have noticed that I said the headroom was incredible in that car, and it really is. This one is actually not that great. I put the seat as low as it could go, reclined it a little bit, and due to the heavy padding on the roof around the excellent looking, sunroofs, which is nice to have, it wasn't as good. My head grazed the roof a number of times. And again, I am a larger driver, not everyone's going to have that issue of course, but it is something that needs to be noted. I was surprised by that, let's say, because it is a much larger car than the previous one, and yet it feels a little lower and a little sleeker, which to me was a little disappointing in comparison. It shouldn't be too much of an issue unless you're 6'3" or above, but again, it's just something which I had to point out because it was basically the only downside to this car. I will also say that if you're not a fan of diesels, you should probably look into that 3 litre V6 supercharged petrol version, because although the soundproofing on this one is really good at higher speeds, at low speeds, especially if you put your foot down and use that torque, you can certainly hear that diesel engine, even with the soundproofing of the cabin. So if you're not a fan of that, look into the petrol version. If you don't mind that, sound, which isn't really a disadvantage in my opinion, then the diesel has a huge amount to offer. Great torque, really good acceleration for what it is, fantastic fuel economy, and to me the thing that really stuck with me the most about the car was that interior design. It's a lovely place to be. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts, and of course, as I always like to say on these reviews, if you are or were an owner of one of these, maybe even an older one, check out that video of course, but leave your thoughts, stories, recommendations, maybe even warnings for other viewers down in the comments so that they can come in and maybe read some of those comments if they're considering one themselves. If you're not a previous owner, just tell me your thoughts down below, what you think of the car, and which one do you prefer, because it's certainly something which could go either way. I could see people loving this one or loving the more retro style, and as I said in my other review, the older one is definitely the car for me overall, but there's plenty to love about this one as well. That's it from me though, so of course if you want to check out more Beards and Cars road test reviews, click here on screen, and of course until next time I'll see you then, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.